So, David, picture the scene. I've got in this house a 14-year-old and a nearly 13-year-old. Some might say they're Gen Z, some might say they're Gen Alpha, and they're emerging with this new language. Is it French? Is it German? No. So let me see what you know about some of this Gen Alpha/Gen Z language.
Go on then.
If I say goat.
Oh, people use it in like football, of in like greatest of all time, which is just really annoying because I can't have that. I mean, not Jamie Vardy, then it's nothing, is it?
Yeah. And if I was to say this podcast has got Riz.
That sounds like a washing detergent.
I think it's supposed to mean charisma, but I could be wrong.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a compliment then. We'll take that. Happy with that.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome to Agonomics.
Welcome to Agonomics.
With David and Jack.
With David and Jack.
Are you just repeating me?
Are you just repeating me?
You're so annoying. Please stop.
You're so annoying. Please stop.
I'm Jack Watts.
Ah, well played. Even I can't bring myself to say that. Shall we just get on with the show?
Definitely. This podcast looks at the world of agriculture and economics,
helping you understand the numbers behind the stories.
This week, our focus is on a final harvest roundup.
We'll be joined by our AHDB colleague, Olivia Bonser, to take us through the figures.
Please follow or subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode.
New shows drop every Wednesday at midday, and please get in touch.
Comment on any of AHDB's social channels.
Or email us agonomics@ahdb.org.uk and let us know where you're listening.
A reminder that last week we concentrated on the blue tongue virus. So if you want more details and how it's affecting ruminants, then please do listen to that episode or go to the AHDB website where we have the latest updates, news and advice.
And before we get into the harvest roundup, do keep an ear out for something that sounds out of place, as we've both got a mystery word, phrase, thing or person that quite frankly has no right to be in a podcast about agriculture or economics to try and slip in unnoticed. It won't be Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris or Two-Pin Plug this week.
So this week we are going to have a bit of a harvest roundup and see how the harvest has progressed. We're calling this a final harvest roundup, but I think that's not to say that harvest is by far complete. We know that there are some real challenges, particularly in north of England and Scotland, about getting final crops off the fields, and hopefully this reasonable weather that we're having in mid-September is helping that effort to get harvest at that edge closer. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at on a crop-by-crop basis and talk about progress and what that means for the market.
Olivia, let's talk about wheat then, and where we are with the main cash crop for the harvest, as ever. As Jack said, there's been some struggles with slower harvesting as we've gone further north because of the weather. But what's the latest in terms of yield and quality from a wheat perspective as well?
We are sort of nearing completion in England, especially in terms of harvest. Still a bit left to do in Scotland, like you say, because of the wetter weather that we've had recently. And so far in our harvest reporting, we're seeing an average yield of about 7.42 tonnes per hectare. That is down about 8% on the 5-year average. So we have seen, as a result of the wet weather throughout the season, quite a reduction to that yield average. And also in terms of the quality side of things, for milling wheat, generally it's looked okay, apart from on the protein side. So averaging about 11.5 to 12% protein, which is a little bit lower than what we'd like. And on top of the smaller crop, it kind of adds to concerns over the milling wheat supply this season.
And where do we stand on milling wheat with regards to ergots? Because that was something that we've briefly mentioned previously. And I was at a meeting of flour millers last week, and it came up quite prevalent in terms of the volume of loads that were turning up with ergot in is significant this year. So is that something that's particularly widespread?
Yeah, definitely. It is something that we've heard quite a lot about this year. It's sort of taking a bit of time to process the volume of wheat that we've got that contains ergot. And also, obviously, it comes at quite a cost to farmers as well.
So should we talk about, I suppose, what it means for total production there? So we're talking about yield, because we've also had recently released last week some estimates of UK production from Cosoral, who are a European body of trade associations, so they're sort of the trade association, if that's the right way to put it. And they were estimating from a UK wheat production perspective, the area was 1.525 million hectare, a yield of just under 7.3 tonnes a hectare, which gives a production of about 11.1 million. Now, as you were saying, Jack, just in context, it wasn't that long ago, of 5 months or so ago, when people were talking about a crop being significantly below 10 million tonnes, and even below 9 million tonnes, some people were talking about. So that weather definitely improved. But what do you think of that as a sort of total production number, Olivia? Do you think that's maybe potentially a bit on the light side from some of the yield figures that we're seeing?
The yield you're mentioning then is obviously a little bit lower than what we're seeing in our harvest reporting. So, I mean, we put sort of a range of what we expect from production this season out a few weeks ago now, so it's possibly a little bit out of date, but I think we were looking in sort of the range of 10.8 to 11.7 million tonnes, so possibly a bit higher than those figures. I think, like you said, yield, given the season we've had, it is still quite poor, but it's better than what was expected back in the winter. And also a lot of the really poor crops that were planted last winter that were near failure. Some farmers were re-drilling and putting a different spring crop in as well, for example. So on top of that, in East Anglia, where they've had quite sandy soils, the yields have been much better. They haven't been well above average, but they've been sort of in line with average. So we're possibly a little bit more optimistic than those figures that you just mentioned.
And I suppose putting that into, a bigger market context, we saw a significant proportion of imports coming in through the summer period, especially April, May, June, July. I think people were worried about a smaller crop and the quality of that crop. So there was a lot of German and Canadian origin milling wheat coming in through that period. So I suppose it changes the outlook going forwards, doesn't it? We've got a big amount of crop that's been carried over into this season, and then a bigger than expected production number. So it's definitely, I suppose, a different market scenario that we were thinking it's going to be a really tight and tense market, but actually it probably feels a little bit looser now because of slightly higher production than what we're expecting, and a significant carryover stock as well as a continued volume of imports coming in.
Like you said, possibly a bit of a heavier outlook than we probably expected a few months ago. We've seen a little bit of pressure on milling premiums over the last sort of few weeks as well. I think that's reflected in the fact that we've possibly got a bit more than was feared earlier on in the year. But we will still be depending on that imported German and Canadian wheat to an extent. It just might not be as firm a pace of imports as we thought.
Great. So that's wheat then, Olivia. So where do we stand from a barley perspective?
So if we first look at winter barley, harvest is near enough complete in that respect across the whole of the UK. We saw yields averaging about 6.13 tonnes per hectare. So this is down 13% on the 5-year average. So again, I think we're sort of seeing a greater impact on the winter crops than the spring crops, which is probably to be expected. But yeah, much lower yields, obviously, than ordinary year. In terms of quality, it's not too bad. So germination levels above 98% generally across the board. Nitrogen at about 1.5, so a little bit low, but it's sort of usable for our domestic consumption at least. So that's the winter barley side of things. And then for spring barley, we're still combining up in Scotland especially. So harvest was about 80% complete as at the 11th of September. So I'd imagine a bit more progress has been made by now because we have had some better weather as well, but still sort of rounding that harvest up. And in terms of yield, we're looking at about 5.67 tonnes per hectare. So not as bad as the winter barley because that's only about 4% down on the 5-year average. But also quite poor, I guess, because of the wet conditions in the spring as well. And again, nitrogen a little bit on the lower side, but it's more of a problem for sort of export than for what we're using domestically. So it'll be interesting to see on the export side of things what comes out of that crop. But we do still have a lot of the Scottish data to come in yet, which could impact those figures a bit yet, because obviously the good quality spring barley tends to come from those Scottish regions.
And again, looking at those production figures that Coast Rural have put out, a total barley production, it's just under 7.5 million tonnes, and for spring barley, it's about 4.6 million tonnes, which I think is kind of reasonably-ish where we expected.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. Obviously, just that cut to the winter barley area, but quite a hike for the spring barley area. But then we're also seeing that decline in yield. So I think kind of compared to average, that sounds about right.
There's always a big fear, isn't there, when you have a wet autumn and you fear you're going to have this huge diversion of winter crop area into spring barley and have a huge pile of barley to try and export. The malting demand is overwhelmed, and you're left with trying to export huge amounts of feed barley on the international market. I think it feels like a slightly different market this year because of various factors. That low nitrogen spring barley for a variety suited to distilling, that should, in my view, get the attention of distillers to actually find the quality and provides a good quality hedge against possibly even Harvest 25 against a huge unknown. Actually a relatively competitive price, but we'll see if we see that. We saw that before 2014, 2015, sort of that sort of dynamic played out there as well, where we kind of had that once in a decade sort of quality event that did encourage that to happen. So we'll see if that comes through. I think as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, didn't we, when we talked about farm inputs, we were talking about the value of beef versus barley. I think we will see some quite strength in demand in the informal market, whether that's fed on own farm or traded between farms locally, because there's a huge incentive to feed barley to ruminants. The price differentials work, and probably the actual biggest constraint is actually it's not necessarily the feed price, actually, if you've got cattle or not to feed it to.
Yeah, I think that'd be quite an interesting thing to watch this season, especially as well in terms of kind of feed rations and what domestic cereal is sort of favoured. Because like you say, I imagine barley will price in a lot better than wheat, given the kind of tighter wheat balance that we've got. We also are expecting maize to price in quite competitively. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it all turns out.
Another one of the saviours, particularly on barley, is we've seen quite a lot of straw baled this year. That may well have really supported a lot of arable cash flows this harvest, although the price has come back quite a lot, still relatively high, and was clearly higher earlier on in the harvest, and so that may materialise to be a real lifeline for farmers, particularly those that may not normally bale so much straw as they have this year.
That straw price has been going down like a toboggan down a hill. We're going to take a break now and get the latest market information. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about oilseed rape and oats and other crops, and finishing up our harvest roundup.
Hi, I'm Olivia Bonser, Senior Analyst at AHDB, with a look at grain and oilseed markets for the week commencing the 6th of January. Despite some support in wheat markets over the Christmas period, prices have been under pressure in the new year from a strengthening US dollar, technical selling and sluggish global demand. However, Russian wheat crop conditions remain in focus, with warmer than usual temperatures and excess moisture in key growing regions. Persistent hot and dry weather in Argentina is also raising concern over the country's maize crop, which is now in its critical development stage. For rapeseed, new crop prices are supported, with doubts over prospects for global rapeseed production in 2025, though forecasts of heavy soybean supplies from South America limit any major price increases. Over the next few weeks, weather in major exporting countries such as South America and Russia will be key in driving prices. The USDA will also release updated global supply and demand estimates at the end of this week. To stay up to date with the latest data and analysis across arable, red meat and dairy markets, head to hdb.org.uk and click on Markets and Prices.
If you're in the market for another podcast to subscribe to, then look no further than our Manager's Special, AHDB's Food and Farming podcast. Recent episodes include a consumer insight offering on red meat labels and supermarket aisles, as well as a dairy special about our work with retailers to promote milk. If you're after herbs, or rather herbal lays, our shelves are stacked with sage advice on how to introduce lucerne and clover into your fields. In fact, we cater for all tastes, so you'll find sections dedicated to all sectors: pork, cereals and oilseeds, dairy, and beef and lamb. And don't forget our middle aisle, where you can often pick up a bargain episode you didn't know you needed to listen to. Search Food and Farming wherever you get your podcasts. AHDB thanks you for your custom.
Welcome back. We are going to continue our review of the harvest, and with us is Olivia Bonser from the cereals and oilseeds market team. In the first half, we talked about wheat and barley. We're now going to face into, I think, one of the most challenging crops of the rotation in the form of oilseed rape. It has really been at the hands of some quite severe crop failure. Even over the last 10 years now, we've been struggling with cabbage stem flea beetle. And so, Olivia, what does the shape of the oilseed rape harvest provide this year?
For winter oilseed rape, harvest is now complete across the UK. In terms of yields, we're looking down about 7% on the 5-year average, so 2.97 tonnes per hectare. Actually, even though it's been quite a difficult growing season, it doesn't seem to have impacted oil content very much. So that's looking at around 45% on average. In the provisional DEFRA England figures, we saw oilseed rape down about 27% on the year. So all in all, we're expecting quite a small crop this season, given that smaller yield and smaller area combined.
And that touches on something that we said previously, Jack, because we have mentioned a couple of times around food security, as well as the deforestation rules that are coming in and the impact on soy. And not only is it about growing the crop and the effect for arable farmers, it is a food source in terms of vegetable oil that we can produce domestically, and obviously a protein feed as well. So there's an element of this where this is a wider thing than just a nice rotation and a good entry to a wheat crop, and something that can offer that variation in a rotation. There is a bigger impact that spreads into the rest of the market. And I know for a number of years the feed industry has been looking at how to increase its domestic protein sources, and it's just been reduced considerably because the oilseed rape area has been completely taken away.
And you only have to go back a couple of years when we had quite a significant problem in European vegetable oil supplies because of the war in Ukraine, that huge reliance on sunflower oil out of Ukraine.
And we're definitely going to be a net importer of oilseed rape this year, because again, the figures that were released last week from Coastal have got a total UK production of 945,000 tonnes, so below a million.
Wow.
So we're going to be importing more than we produce, I think, for the 24-25 season in the UK. It's a considerable hit. So an area that's now below 300,000 hectares and a yield that's just over 3.1 tonnes a hectare. And there's huge variability across the crop, but there simply is that risk reward balance from a farmer perspective, given all of the disease and pest damage that can come into it. It's just too great. The financial incentive that the market provides just isn't there really for it at all.
Even if the incentive is there, it's difficult because when we talk about risk reward, typically we talk about the risk of getting a variable yield. The risk here is actually having complete crop failure. And so it's the risk is very binary. And so even if the oilseed rape price is like £500 a tonne, you've still got, if your risk of not producing a crop, you've still got £500 a tonne basically times zero, and still zero. That's the nature of the risk. It's quite a new concept, relatively new concept in the UK, of actually a crop that's at risk of complete crop failure versus something that might be at risk of some yield loss.
On paper, it actually looks as if the yields in the UK are quite steady, because 3.2 tonnes a hectare almost for an oilseed rape isn't on average a bad yield compared to what we've seen previously. But it is just that area damage. It's because what's left does produce it, but it's just getting to that point. And I know it's kind of like sort of probably repeating what we've said before, but it's also that you get that double whammy that, you can get a crop established if you sow it early and it can kind of get away and it's nice and vigorous, but then it can still be impacted through the spring when the beetle larvae hatch and eat it from the inside out. So from a farmer perspective, it isn't even as if thinking of wheat planting that you can push it back to get outside of the blackgrass window and you kind of know you're okay. It's because you've got those two periods of risk. Again, an example of an agricultural market working in a very logical way. It just isn't worth taking the risk. So Olivia, after me and Jack there getting a little bit upset over the loss of oilseed rape, is there anything more positive that we can say about the oat harvest this year?
Unfortunately, it does look as well as though the oat yield has been impacted by the poorer conditions this season. So harvest is still progressing, especially up in Scotland. obviously where they've had the wetter weather more recently. But yields in general at the moment are coming in at about 5.07 tonnes per hectare, which are down 7% on the 5-year average. Unfortunately, we don't have a spring and winter oats split, but I would imagine sort of the winter oats especially have taken quite a hit because of those wetter drilling conditions in the winter. And generally the quality is looking okay. I think it's usable, but yeah, not quite enough to sort of fulfill the domestic demand, similarly to last year as well. So we'll have a few imports coming in.
The crop of the year for me has been the spring oat crop. And that might be because I've got some local bias, but there's been quite a lot of it grown near us. Went in very late April, essentially nursed by the weather, and it stood up to all the rain. And it's only actually been recently harvested, but I've been really, really impressed. And I think of all the crops, it's the one crop that deserves to be out on the veranda, puffing away at its cigar.
Like it's in retirement. It's just kind of put his feet up and gone like, yeah, I'm going to make porridge and enjoy it. But looking at the total production figure, again, I'm relying back to my friends at Coastal for these numbers. It's a reasonably good production number. They've put in 970,000 tonnes for oats. So, that's a reasonable number, probably slightly more than we had from last season. And obviously we've seen an increase in oat usage capacity, I should say, over recent years, with an increase in oat processing facilities in England. So yeah, it will be interesting to see how that oat market operates, and maybe something where it's kind of developing a bit more of a robuster demand profile. So could take some of that area that we're losing from oilseed rape, keep it moving into oats if they can offer more of a structured way of keeping the demand going. But as ever, it's all about with oats that price competition with wheat and barley, because with the yield differences, it's always going to be those cash crops of wheat and barley that are going to be the more advantageous ones, unless oats can keep a firm price point relative to them.
That's an interesting point. And I think from a gross margin point of view, oats will always struggle, I think, to compete with those bigger crops. From a capital employed and return on capital, because oats use far less working capital to grow, they actually produce some of the highest return on investment, all the crops in the rotation. And I think that's really interesting with, particularly we're seeing declines in direct payments, people looking to sort of spread risk, and particularly with higher interest rates. That might just be another factor that features in decision making as well. And although it's a cereal crop, you can treat it as a little bit of a break crop as well, so which we really do need. And I think oats, along with SFI, sort of filling some of that need.
Right. Thank you, Olivia, for taking us through all the latest harvest numbers. And Jack, if I'm honest, I don't know if we're getting better or worse at this, because I feel I was able to guess what your mystery word was, and I feel I also made mine really obvious. So I don't know if that's a matter of us getting better or worse at this.
I think we're getting complacent and feel, well, we've done it every week so far, so we must be able to squeeze it in somewhere, and then realising that we haven't actually done it yet.
Was it veranda?
It was, well done. And was yours toboggan?
It was indeed.
Yes.
It was indeed.
I don't know if we've had a week. Maybe when we did conservatory and conservatoire.
I think you might be right, yeah. Score draw. We'll take that as a win.
So thank you very much for listening to this week's episode. Thank you to Olivia for all her input. And please remember to keep an eye on the AHDB website for all of the analysis and insight onto the markets. See you next time.